Today is Tuesday, September 13th, 2011. We're doing an oral history interview for the archives at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. I'm Charles Lundquist. Our guest today is Daryl Adams. We're delighted to have you here today, Daryl.
Good morning, Chuck.
We usually like to start out these oral histories by asking the visitor to tell a little bit about his history, where he came from, where he went to school, and how he got into the space program.
I'll be glad to. I came from Colorado, born back in 1939. Went to Colorado State University in Fort Collins, Colorado, with a degree in electrical engineering. And my first job was with Boeing in Seattle. And at that point, I was in the Minuteman missile program, learning to be a field service representative. And so we did work at Vandenberg Air Force Base, Minot Air Force Base in the installation of the Minuteman missile system. And after 3 years, I moved to New Orleans to join Chrysler Corporation on the S-1B program. And that was my introduction to NASA. So that was in 1964. And in 64, I worked at Michoud on the S-1C, or S-1B, actually. And then I heard word that the Mississippi Test Facility in Picayune and Bay St. Louis was being activated. And it just sounds like exciting work. So I went in and applied, and not knowing it was such a transition point, because the focus of our space program to get man on the moon by the end of the decade was really transitioning over to Mississippi.
That was a major challenge to everybody.
It certainly was, and little did I realize that I was going to be right in the mix of it. So I went over there. There were probably 300 or 400 people, and within a few months there were over 1,000 people. And facilities weren't built. We were in trailers in the mud. I mean, it was quite a situation. The workload was tremendous, and I've got a lot of tales to tell over the next couple of years in some of our getting ready for that.
I'll tell one or two at least.
Well, actually, one of the first things that happened is they had made some major decisions to put the all systems test vehicle at Mississippi instead of firing it at San Jose, California. And in doing that, we had to totally reconfigure one of the test stands. And while we were in that process of reconfiguring it, I was given the job of being the ground instrumentation engineer. So all of the drag-on cables and the transducers and the installations for some of the ground tests that were coming up.
That was a lot of responsibility.
It really was. And here I was, a 25-year-old engineer, but I was having a ball. I was really having a ball.
I dare say.
It was fun. And so that 60 hours a week, 6 days a week, 10 hours a day, I was living in New Orleans, driving back and forth. And it was just fun work. And following that, then the Hurricane Betsy comes in 1965 in September, and did some damage to some of the equipment out there. And from that point on, there were continual setbacks that were unexpected, and we overcame them. And me being a fresh engineer, I was just thinking that was part of the deal. And
And in a sense it is.
Well, it was, and it was probably some of the best time I had being an engineer, is the work I did down in Mississippi.
Well, after Mississippi, what did you do?
Well, I stayed down in Picayune at the test site until after our moon landing back in 1969. And Hurricane Camille comes along, and about that time, I decided that I would like to return to Denver. We had a daughter that was 4 years old and would like to let her come back and see her grandparents. So we moved back to Denver, and I worked for Martin Marietta on the Skylab program. And while we were in Denver, the program said we would like our contractor in Huntsville. So we got to be there for 2 years, and then my wife, my daughter, and myself moved to Huntsville in 1971, and we've been here ever since, enjoying living here very much. I worked for Martin Marietta until 1975. And
that was through the whole Skylab.
That was through the whole Skylab program.
What was your role in Skylab?
Well, I was actually I had 2 different roles. I began working in the mission evaluation area, and partway through, I took over a group to support public affairs. Bart Slattery and Joe Jones and those folks, and I headed up a group that supported public affairs in writing exhibits. We made a couple movies. We made a whole series of educational television programs that are, I believe, still in the NASA archives, one called Science and Skylab. And they were shown through the Alabama ETV network to students. And so I balanced my Skylab experience really finishing off in the public affairs. And then at the end of the Skylab program, I switched and got a job with Rockwell International. And from that point on, it was public affairs work and business development. And that's where I retired in 1996 from Rockwell. And then following Rockwell, I started a consulting business. And then following that, one of my clients, Qualys Corporation, woman-owned engineering company here in town, hired me as vice president of business development.
Oh, very good.
And I retired from Qualys in 2009. And from that point on, I've been retired. So that's a thumbnail sketch.
That's a very nice summary of your career, a very enviable career.
Well, it was fun. It was fun, and as I mentioned before, some of the best times in the space program I felt I lived through.
You interacted and interfaced with a lot of NASA people. Do you have any particular ones that you admired, or any comments you'd like to make about them?
Well, when I was working with Rockwell, I was in business development, and so constantly I was out on the center dealing with the program development people, the advanced engineering people on the 3rd floor of 4200. I came over and saw you several times.
Yes, I remember that.
And it was in the interest, of course, building business for Rockwell, but at the same time, it was getting involved with what was happening in Marshall and seeing how Rockwell could work with Marshall. One thing that I remember distinctly was when we formed the National Space Club in Huntsville. I was president one year, and we had the anniversary. I'm trying to think which anniversary it was of the moon landing. Time flies, you know, and you got to, so this would have been the 25th, I guess. And we had we began the moon buggy races, Frank 6.
Oh, yes.
Started the moon buggy races, and we had those on the center. Bill Halsey was in charge of the work at Marshall, and they dedicated the Werner von Braun bust in the von Braun courtyard. And I was worked with the downtown, the celebration, where we had the moon buggies come around and go around the courthouse, and we had a recreation of some of the 60s bands and dancing in the streets. Remember Werner von Braun's speech? He said there will be dancing in the streets.
Yes, yes.
And we used that as our theme that year.
Let's come back to Skylab. That was a very large enterprise. I think we touched a little lightly on that. Can you get a little more depth of your recollections of Skylab?
Skylab was Martin Marietta made the orbital, they made the multiple docking adapter, and they were the integration contractor for the Skylab. So we got involved in lots of the experiments and some of the integration of the activities. The program itself, I wasn't involved that closely with the actual program or program management, but I got involved in the Apollo telescope mount, the multiple docking adapter, the workshop, and the various components as they work together, especially in the mission evaluation that we did.
There were many student experiments on Skylab. Did you get involved in those?
Personally, no. But when I was doing the public affairs
That's
work,
what I would have thought.
when I was doing the public affairs work, we had some of our programs dedicated to some of the student experiments. And of course, the Spider
Was
is the one that
real hit. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I don't know that much about it other than it got really all the press. And I don't even recall the results, whether the Spider spun the web or not.
It did. She, what was her name?
Isabel or Annabelle or
something like that. And in the end, she had no trouble making a very nice web in zero-G, which surprised everybody, actually. And I'm sure you got to write about that.
Yes, we
in
did.
Press releases.
Yeah, we certainly did.
The girl that brought the student that brought up that experiment became rather famous for it.
Yes, she did.
So
Yes, she did.
high school student suddenly was a internationally known experiment.
Yeah. Well, it's, you bringing up all these things, you just, you mentioned something and then start thinking about it, and hadn't thought about a lot of these things for quite some time.
Well, one of the other things we've observed over the years is how the influx of engineers and scientists to Huntsville has influenced the culture of Huntsville. And I know you've been very involved in a program at the WLRH station, and why don't you tell us about that so we get that on the record?
Okay, glad to. When I was a boy, of course, radio was the center of the house, and radio programs were always on, and we had our favorite programs, and we'd sit and listen. And in my fantasy imagination, I always wondered, I would like to be involved in radio someplace. And but I never dreamed that I would. And it turned out that when I was in the Huntsville concert band, I was a cornet player. WLRH was announced in the band that the band would sponsor a program of band music on public radio, and they asked volunteers in the radio station at the band rehearsal who'd like to help. And I said, I'd like to help, behind the scenes. And so I volunteered, and the program was called the Band Hour. It's on 9 o'clock on Saturday mornings, and they were just looking for volunteers. Well, pretty soon it evolved into you become a voice and start pulling the programs together. And then pretty soon some of these other volunteers dropped off. And before 6 months had gone, I was the guy.
You were the chairman.
I was the guy. And I've been doing this program every Saturday morning on WLRH since 1976. And this will be our 35th year anniversary.
I guess that makes you an anchor.
It makes me one of the anchors there. That's correct. An unpaid anchor. And it is just a fun thing for me to do.
The name has changed, hasn't it?
No, it's brass, reeds, and percussion.
Okay, but that's not the band hour. It's brass.
Oh, no, programs, yeah, right. You're correct. You're correct. That's the band hour. That's what they did call it. But I think we used brass, reeds, and percussion somewhere in that
Okay.
in that name.
And you're still doing it?
I'm still doing it every Saturday morning. Now it's at noon. It's not the best time, but people driving in their cars, they hear it. And last Saturday I did my football program with all the football fight songs.
Oh.
And actually it was on the 4th. No, I guess that was last Saturday. And of course there were games going on right at that time, so a lot of the people watching the games didn't obviously hear it.
Where do you find the music, the recordings to do this? From your own collection or from their studios? Or?
No, they're from me. When we started, we got gifts from the colleges and high schools and universities and military organizations. And now I get them pretty much, I bought several. We've been to, I've taken some trips around the world, over to England and France. And I bought some materials there. But lately, it's pretty much what the military sends me. And they've got just a wealth of stuff. But they cannot sell their material. So I'm just fortunate.
So you get it free?
I get it free, and it is very, very good material. Very good. Nowhere near could I use all I have. And in our home life, we've downsized, and so consequently, I've gotten rid of all my vinyl records. So I don't have access to those anymore. But I still have enough CDs that I can carry forward.
Well, often we like to ask the guest what words of wisdom they'd like to leave for the coming generations, for the young folks that are now getting into science and getting into space. Do you have any thoughts you'd like to leave with them?
Well, I think that don't get discouraged with the job outlook in the immediate future, because science is exciting, engineering is exciting. You can apply this engineering to all kinds of things, and you've got to stick to the basics. And we just have to look forward. We know that we're going to have a space program, a missile program, an airplane program. We know there's going to be technologies that are developed that we don't even realize today that are going to need to have that basic education and mathematics and engineering fundamentals that will allow them to proceed, and we may not even know what they are. But in reflecting back in my career, the time of getting ready to go to the moon back in the 60s, my engineering background prepared me to do what I needed to do. It allowed me to understand the importance of what we were doing. I couldn't design the spaceship at the time, but I certainly understood what it is we were doing, and was able to apply this to getting the program going. And again, I didn't realize at the time the transition that our space program was taking back in those days, and it was just so exciting, so exciting.
Well, often in these interviews, when we get through, the guest, after we turn off the machine, says, "Oh, I forgot to talk about something." Is there anything that you now think about that you'd like to have mentioned that I forgot to ask about?
Well, like to mention also, that about my wife. My wife and I have been married 52 years, and both grew up in in Colorado. Matter of fact, we're going back next week to our 50th college reunion. See some of the people that haven't seen in many, many years. And so we're going to be doing that, and we're looking forward to that trip. And my wife, she's been with me every place we've been: Santa Maria, California, Minot, North Dakota, New Orleans. She's taught school in all those places. And finally in Huntsville, she taught briefly here. Our daughter has gone through the schools here and graduated and taught for a while at Randolph.
Just for the record, why don't you give the names of your wife and daughter?
Okay, my wife's name is Jimmalee Adams, and my daughter is Jenna Perani. Granddaughters Elizabeth and Catherine Perani, and they live in Huntsville, fairly near us, matter of fact. And our oldest granddaughter is ready to go to college next year, and our youngest is a sophomore at Randolph. He's getting ready to move on out. It's hard to believe that they're.
It's good to put these things in the record. 50 years from now,
Yeah.
100 years from now,
Yeah.
somebody doing research on this era may wonder about that, and it's good to have them in the record.
Yes.
And anything else you would like to get in the record while we're...
Well, another thing that I really enjoy is being on the symphony board. I've been on the symphony board since the early 90s. I'm a trustee emeritus right now because I've served my 10 years, but I very much enjoy attending the Huntsville Symphony and participating in some of the things that the symphony does, and marvel at some of the quality of arts that we have in Huntsville.
One thing that might have slipped through, it just occurred to me, you didn't say much about your bosses when you were working for the various companies. Are there any of those that are outstanding and you should mention?
There was one that I would love to mention. He's no longer with us. His name is Jack Seiler. He worked for North American Aviation at Mississippi, and he was a mentor to me. He was a fellow that could inspire you. There wasn't anything that you couldn't do. Jack would say, "You can do it." He says, "Figure it out. You know what? We can do it." And he just was a perfect mentor to me, and I thoroughly enjoyed working with Jack. And he's, as I say, it was Mississippi at the time. He was really one of the boss that I really admire the most.
Well, it's good to give some recognition to that.
Well, I'm sorry that Jack couldn't be around to hear that, but I think he knew that.
Well, some historian may pick that up.
Yeah, could be. Could very well be.
Well, if you have no further comments, thank you very much for coming in today and making this interview.
Well,
I'm delighted to have had you.
thank you very much, Chuck.